All right, hello. My name is Olivia Finney, and this is my final project for WLC 310. So, okay, why is this not? There we go. Okay, so for my final project, I decided to go ahead and create a digital painting, which I kind of wanted to represent Russia and Russia's culture. So now I followed the standard artistic process with the addition of doing some research on the subject matter, since this obviously had to be a dedicated subject matter. So as far as research went, I took inspiration from a lot of different traditional Russian artwork movements, such as the Wanderers, Romanticism, various folklore paintings. I also looked at historical photography by Sergei Prokudin-Gorsky, and I also looked at socialist realism and the themes and artistic measures used within that. I also did some of my own research on traditional Russian housing and other various artworks. So to start us off, the Wanderers movement, what I kind of liked about this was the slice of life feel, and it had a very proto-modern vibe to it. I particularly liked how it was a more humanistic take on what life of the average man was like in Russia during that time period. Some artists I looked at were Ilya Repkin, and I particularly liked some of his fairy tale artwork, as that had more of a dreamy kind of not really fake, but more like dreamy, just mystical vibe to it, and I really liked that feel. I also looked at Ivan Shishkin because I very much liked how he represented native Russian flora and how he showed his perception of nature and the natural world in his paintings. I also really liked the types of plants that he portrayed. And lastly, Isaac Levitin, again, I actually really liked how he portrayed birch trees. So that was something that I potentially wanted to incorporate into my own artwork. Next, we have Russian Romanticism, and I really like the dynamic lighting, the chiaroscuro style of like a very bright contrasted by very dark background that was evident in many of the portraits and many of the still lifes created during this period. I also, again, really like the distinct foreground and background and decided that I could potentially try and implicate that in my own artwork. I also really like the color schemes and how many of the palettes kind of had like not like a very intense feel, but more of like a kind of washed out, gritty texture. I really like that. Um, so some artists that I looked at for this movement was Ivan Kramskoy, and I particularly, again, liked how he did his textures. It was very like canvasy, very gritty, and I also liked how he portrayed his plant species. And Viktor Vasnitov did a lot of very nice fairy tale artwork. However, what I liked more about him was that his color palette was very dark and kind of like had a very obvious lighter focal point. So I decided I could potentially incorporate that as well. As far as photography goes, I liked Sergei Prokhin-Gorsky because he kind of had a nice little snapshot of what life was like for your average Russian. He was also notable in that he didn't really portray more glamorous historical figures, but more just portraiture of the common man and what they were doing in the moments and all that. Lastly, I did look at some of these socialist realism pieces that we covered in class. I liked it because it was ideologically very important. Like Russia and the Soviet Union were obviously at the front of every piece, as it was essentially propaganda. It was very distinctly Russian and Soviet. And if you had to ask most people what they think of when they think of Russian artwork, this would be that movement. So I was potentially going to try and incorporate that. I also liked how it has like a very, very select and specific characteristics in this genre of artwork, notably how the characters are posed are typically in overly masculine poses, very strong outward physical appearance. I also like the more realistic take on their on how people are drawn, even if it's like a highly stylized realism, and that's something I like. I also like the palettes and the color scheme, how it tends to be more grayscale or neutral with oftentimes red accents, or conversely, it could be very bright and colorful. This again kind of ties into its retro feel and how it had a very optimistic, future thinking, scientific view on the world that was characteristic of the Soviet Union, which is something I find interesting. I also, again, like how it portrays more of the common person or your average laborer, worker, proletariat, all that. and the black and white morality and the expressionism used within these pictures is also very interesting to me. So in addition to all of the class material, I did some of my own independent research. So I looked at what are Russian log cabins. They're called izbas, and they're kind of more like a traditional forest dwelling type cabin. They're actually even American log cabins are based pretty heavily on this in terms of design, it turns out. So that was cool. And I also looked at some various Soviet bloc architecture, just brutalism and all that. As far as photography goes, I actually found a rather interesting survey of the Russian Empire taken during 1910. And this was, again, just a kind of a set of photographs that was more slice of life, depicting what life was like in the Russian Empire and the Urals during this time. So there were some interesting pictures from that. Lastly, I actually found an artist, Ivan Bilibin, whose artwork I really liked. He does a lot of storybook book artwork, and he has very distinct line art, a distinct color palette. I really like how he fills up his space and how he uses a lot of little details to really just move your eye around that canvas. And even after you think you've seen everything, there's always going to be something else in there. So I found that very interesting and very telling. And notably, he did actually do a book called Vasilia the Beautiful, as it translates to, and that was quite the illustrations in that were quite beautiful. I really like them. It depicts Baba Yaga and Russian fairy tales. So then after I finished up doing my research and looking at what Russian artwork I could find, I had to figure out what I wanted to depict in my own artwork. So I decided that I wanted to do a fairy tale, and heavily inspired by Ivan Bilibin, I decided to depict Baba Yaga. I also kind of wanted to incorporate a physical boundary between like new and old Russia, and I decided to do that as like a field of wheat or like a field of grass. I also kind of wanted to incorporate the slice of life of the average person that was present in so many of the Russian movements, because I feel like just the slice of life of your average everyday person is a very, very Russian characteristic for artwork and for photography to have. I also decided to try and portray some mysticism, again, going with the fairy tale aspect. So here is some of the artwork that I selected for my final inspiration. As you can see, here's Ivan Bilibin's depiction of Baba Yaga and of Valissa. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, sorry. But yeah, as you can see, he has very distinct line art. He has a very, very interesting usage of colors. He also likes to add a lot of small details, something which I am very, very fond of. I really like that. So yeah, it's just overall great artwork, very good. It's highly traditional, but also very modern in that it reads more as like a screen, not a screen print, a litho print or something, like a wood print or a woodcut of some sort. I also looked at some of Ivan Shishkin's works specifically to get a good feel for what flora Russia has, and like what kind of plants would I have to put in my artwork for people to be able to look at it and go, ah, yes, that looks Russian. That like the plants and everything make me think that, hey, this area is in Russia because all of the plants are native there. I also looked at Viktor Vanetsev's work, not necessarily for any conceptual ideas. This mostly what I wanted to take from this was his color palette, and just that I really liked how he has like a lighter foreground contrasted sharply by a dark, dismal green background, not to mention the whole muddy water that's like pretty brown. I really like the colors and the color scheme of this, how it moves your eye around the campus. And this is one of the survey paintings from the Urals. I kind of like the composition of it and just the slice of life feel. The colors were also rather nice too. Here is one of the traditional Russian log cabins, and here is a 20th century Soviet realism picture, which is depicting a woman in a brightly lit field of grain, and I particularly like the grain and the color of that, so I decided to potentially include it. So after that, after I kind of like decided what I wanted to draw, I went ahead and I did like some little thumbnail sketches, which are basically just little rough sketches that artists use to kind of work out what they want to go on in their picture. And as you can see, I kind of initially did like a combination of fairy tales. Like you can see a couple of them are depicting Baba Yaga. And I also had like a bunch of Soviet realism inspired ones. However, I decided to not go with the more Soviet realism ones because I wasn't so sure that I could pull off that characteristic, highly realistic, but also highly idealized facial structure that those paintings are known for. So I wasn't so sure if I could manage that. So I didn't decide to go with that. What I actually decided to do from these thumbnail sketches was the one, as you can see on the very right bottom, that is a depiction of a child looking at Baba Yaga standing in a clearing next to a forest. And that is what I decided to go for my final. So here is my final product. As you can see, it's pretty consistent with what I'd had for my thumbnail sketch. I just moved around some aspects of it and whatnot. Baba Yaga's in her house instead of in the field, but overall, I do think that this was pretty good. I'm pretty happy with this painting, so yeah. So now on to what I wanted this painting to represent. So I kind of wanted this painting to represent the boundary between old and new Russia. So I chose to portray that as a physical boundary of like a grass field. And I chose to make that a very bright, distinct color to kind of really emphasize that there's this girl on one side and then there's the traditional fairy tales on the other side. I also kind of wanted to show a childhood link to culture. So this is shown as the girl who is obviously, she's a modern child. She has like a puffy jacket. She's from modern Russia. She's viewing and interacting with a notorious fairy tale figure, Baba Yaga. So that's kind of like a callback to the history of her culture and how she's like learning about that and interacting with that. I also kind of wanted to give the painting a more dreamlike feel. The girl in the foreground is more real and grounded, while the forest is meant to represent history and tradition. It's an old growth forest, obviously, and I used like a more ominous green lighting to make it seem more otherworldly. That lighting is also why Baba Yaga's house has this red light emanating out of it. So that light was meant to make her stand out as something ominous and ancient. However, that calls back to like Russian fairy tales where again, Baba Yaga is oftentimes the bad guy. She was said to be a witch who eats children. However, in the older tales, she isn't actually always evil. She can either help or hinder the protagonist. So that's why I portrayed Baba Yaga herself in a rather neutral pose as to kind of show that, hey, despite appearances, she could potentially be an ally to the girl. So this is also the girl, the girl in her pose. This is also kind of a callback to more traditional Russian fairy tale heroes, in that the girl has a little stick that she's pretending with a sword. So she is the protagonist of this story. So lastly, I also wanted to portray many aspects of Russian artwork that we have learned about this quarter in my painting. So as you can see, it was very heavily influenced by Ivan Bilibin, the trees, the way that I portrayed the structure of those trees and the branches and the moss and the algae growing off of those trees, all the lichen, that is very, very heavily based off of him. You can also see that I have little Phlymantia mushrooms, like the red mushrooms growing near Baba Yaga's feet. So that was, again, her house's feet, not her feet. So that was, again, a heavy callback to Ivan Bilibin, as he likes to draw those little mushrooms and they're very cute. I also took heavily from his typical color palettes, and that is more of a muted green feel too. And his Baba Yaga design, her clothes, was also something that I directly took from his artwork. Ivan Shishkin, you can see more of his influence on my painting in the types of plants in the birch tree that's in the center. You can also kind of see my groutweed grass in the background and many of like how I styled like the little bushes. There's kind of a callback to his artwork. Viktor Venetstov, I mostly took his color palette, how you can see the very dark muted green in the background contrasted more heavily by a lighter, more bright color in the foreground, which really brings your eye forward. And lastly, Baba Yaga's house is obviously, again, a traditional Russian cabin. All right, so that is what I wanted to represent and what I hope I achieved in representing with my artwork. And yeah, thank you very much for coming to my presentation. And here are my works cited. Thank you.